The thing in the ground was breathing, and the Velhari survey team had no word for what that meant. Overseer San Korath stood at the lip of the excavation pit and watched the great dark shape twitch under the floodlights. It was 40 days since the diggers had broken the crust of the dead world they had labeled Site 92. It was a gray planet, airless, useless, one of 9,000 worlds the Velhari Combine had catalogued and dismissed in a single short season. Nothing lived here. Nothing had ever lived here. And yet, 300 meters down, the sensors kept reporting a slow rise and fall, a rhythm, like a chest moving in sleep. Korath had laughed when the first report came in. He laughed easily. He was good at it, and his crews liked him for it, because a captain who laughed was a captain who was not afraid. He stood among 40 technicians from the Combine's reclamation branch, and he told them that planets did not breathe, that the rhythm was a thermal artifact, a pocket of frozen gas settling as the dig warmed the rock. They had laughed with him. They were professionals. They scraped worlds clean of metal for a living, and they had pulled 10,000 dead human things out of 10,000 graves, and not one of those things had ever woken up. Because that was the joke, and Korath told it well. The thing in the ground was human. The humans had been gone for a long time. The Combine taught it to every hatchling in the brood schools. There had been a species once, soft and warm and short-lived, who had spread across a small arm of the galaxy and then simply stopped. Their worlds went quiet. Their ships went dark. The Combine's historians argued about why, but they agreed on the important part, the part that mattered to a reclamation crew with a quota to fill. The humans were dead. Their machines were scrap, and scrap was worth money. The Combine had built its entire fortune on that truth. For 9,000 years, the reclamation branch had crawled across the dead human worlds like patient insects, prying open silent cities and silent shipyards and silent graves, melting down the bones of a species that had reached too far and fallen. Whole Velhari families had grown rich on human metal. Whole generations had never known a galaxy in which humanity was anything but a number in a ledger, a tonnage to be weighed, a price to be set. The humans were not a people to the Velhari. They were a resource, and Korath had spent his whole working life turning that resource into money, and he had never once lost a night of sleep over it. So Korath's people dug. They dug through 300 meters of poured stone and layered alloy, through blast doors thicker than a Velhari was tall, through a tomb that someone had built with terrible care to keep a thing safe or to keep a thing in. And when the last shovel of gray dust slid away and the floodlights found the surface beneath, the entire excavation crew went silent at the same moment, and the silence was not professional at all. It was a ship. They had known it would be a ship. The buried mass was 900 meters long, a single hull, and the sensors had told them its rough shape weeks ago. But knowing a number and seeing the thing are different acts, and seeing it stopped the breath in 40 Velhari throats. The hull was the color of cold iron. It was scarred. Not damaged, scarred. The way an old soldier is scarred. Every mark a thing survived rather than a thing suffered. There were tower mounts along its spine the size of Combine frigates. There were sealed ports in rows, hundreds of them, each one a closed eye. And across the prow, in raised letters tall enough that Korath could read them from the rim of the pit, was a name in the old human script that the translators had long since cracked. HFY Iron. Korath asked his catalog officer what the words meant. The officer, a careful young Velhari named Tessic, ran them through the lexicon and said the first word meant a shield, a thing carried in front of a body to stop a blow. The second pair he could not place exactly. The closest the lexicon gave was a phrase, a hard cold metal that holds its edge, a metal that does not bend in the dark. Korath nodded and filed it away as a name, the way the dead so often named their tools after qualities they wished they had. He should have listened harder. The dead do not name a tomb ship after a shield by accident. But Korath was a reclamation man, and his job was metal, not poetry. He stood at the rim and studied the great scarred hull the way a butcher studies a carcass, already cutting it apart in his mind, already weighing the spine mounts and the armor plate and the strange dense core his deep sensors could not quite read. He had pulled 1,000 human ships out of the ground in his career, and not one of them had been anything but scrap. The biggest had been 400 meters. This one was more than twice that, and the metal in it read denser than anything the Combine knew how to make, and a small, careful voice, somewhere behind Korath's confidence, told him that a ship this size, built this strong, buried this deep, under a tomb this thorough, was not a thing a species threw away. It was a thing a species hid. He told the small, careful voice to be quiet. He had a quota. He gave the order to bring up the heavy lifters and begin the slow work of cracking the hull for its valuable insides. The Aegis Far Iron would be towed to orbit in pieces, weighed, sorted, sold. That was the future the Combine had decided for it 9,000 worlds ago, and Korath had no reason to think this world would be different from any of the others. He gave the order at the start of the work cycle. By the middle of that same cycle, the rhythm under the hull had changed. Tessic noticed it first. The young officer had been monitoring the deep sensors, the ones that read the slow breathing, more out of habit than purpose. The rise and fall had been steady for 40 days, a beat every 9 seconds, patient as a glacier. Now it was faster, a beat every 6 seconds, then every 4. Tessic watched the number climb and felt something cold move down the long bones of his spine, and he called the overseer over and pointed at the screen and said, without quite meaning to whisper, that the ship was waking up. Korath laughed again. It was a thinner laugh this time. He said a dead ship could not wake, that the rhythm was nothing but their own drills warming the reactor core, that an old human fusion plant settling toward equilibrium would naturally pulse as it cycled. He believed it, mostly. He needed to believe it. Behind him, on the pit floor, 90 workers crawled across the surface of the Aegis Far Iron like insects on the flank of a sleeping beast, drilling, cutting, prying at the sealed eyes of its weapon ports. Tessic did not laugh. Tessic kept his eyes on the deep sensor, and he watched the rhythm climb past every value the Combine's archives had ever recorded for a settling reactor, and he understood, with the clean, cold clarity of a young mind that has not yet learned to lie to itself, that whatever his overseer said, this was not a machine warming up. This was a thing waking from a long sleep. He had seen the same curve once, in a Brood School text, in a chart of a Velhari heart rising out of deep hibernation, slow, then faster still, as the body remembered how to be awake. He looked at the great scarred hull below him, and he could not stop thinking the word, the wrong, impossible word, the word the Combine had spent 9,000 years teaching its children never to fear. Alive. The first port opened on its own. It did not blow open or break. It simply unsealed, with a long, slow hiss of equalizing pressure, and a column of warm air vented out into the cold of the pit and turned instantly to fog. The workers nearest the port scrambled backward. Korath's laughter stopped. And in the new quiet, every Velhari in the excavation heard the sound that came up out of the open port, faint and rising, a sound the old human engineers had built into the waking sequence of their warships on purpose, so that anyone standing over the grave would know, in their last clear moments, exactly what they had dug up. It was a voice, a recorded human voice, calm and unhurried, speaking the old human tongue. The translators caught it and rendered it to text on Tessic's screen, a half-second behind, and the young officer read the words and could not make his throat work to say them aloud. Reactor warm, crew waking, hull integrity nominal. Hello again, Galaxy. We have been asleep for a while. Korath ordered the dig stopped. He ordered the lifters pulled back and the crews recalled and the survey ship in orbit brought to readiness. He told himself it was caution and not fear, and he was a captain, so the difference mattered to him, even if it mattered to no one else. He stood at the rim of the pit and watched the second port open, and the third, and the fourth, a slow ripple of waking eyes running down the 900 meters of the Aegis Far Iron, and he understood for the first time that the breathing he had laughed at had never been the reactor. It had been a countdown. The Velhari Combine had 300 ships in the sector, a reclamation fleet built to strip worlds, not to fight them. Korath called the nearest of them, the patrol cutter Veshin's Edge, and reported a possible reactivation event, and asked for guidance, and tried very hard to keep his voice level while he did it. The cutter's commander told him to relax. The cutter's commander reminded him that humans were dead, and human machines were scrap, and a reclamation crew that panicked over a warm core would be the laughingstock of the whole combine. The cutter's commander, in short, did exactly what Korath himself had done 40 days ago, and 40 hours ago, and 40 minutes ago. He laughed. Then the floodlights went out, all of them, across the entire excavation in the same instant, and in the sudden dark of the pit, 300 meters down on a world that had been dead for 9,000 years, the Aegis Far Iron opened its eyes and looked up at the Velhari, who had come to take it apart, and decided that it would not be taken. That was the moment the laughing stopped, across the whole combine, and never quite started again. The floodlights came back 9 seconds later, but they were not the Velhari floodlights anymore. The Aegis Far Iron lit itself. Strips of cold white light ran along its scarred flanks, tracing the shape of the hull, and the rows of open ports glowed with a deep amber from within. To Korath, standing frozen at the rim of the pit, the ship looked less like a machine and more like a thing that had spent 9,000 years holding its breath and had finally, slowly, let it out. The light reflected off the faces of his crew, and every face wore the same expression, which was the expression of a creature that has just understood it made a serious mistake. Inside the ship, a woman was opening her eyes. Her name was Captain Imogen Hale, and the last thing she remembered was the order to go down. She remembered the bridge of the Aegis Far Iron and the long, terrible math of a war that humanity was losing, not for lack of courage, but for lack of time. She remembered the decision the Admiralty had made, the one no one had wanted to make. Bury the best of them, seed the dead worlds with sleeping ships and sleeping crews, hide them under 300 meters of stone, and set them to wake only if something came digging. Wait out the enemy, wait out the war, wait if it came to it, 9,000 years, for the day the galaxy forgot that humans had teeth. Hale had been 29 years old when they sealed the tomb. By every clock that mattered, she still was. The cradle had held her cells in a long, cold pause, neither living nor dead, and now it warmed her back to herself in careful stages, and the first sensation she had after 9,000 years was the soft chime of the ship telling her that the hull had been breached, and the enemy was standing on the grave. She did not panic. That was the first thing the Velhari would learn about the woman in the cold iron ship, though they did not know her name yet, and would not for some time. She did not panic. She lay in the cradle and let the ship feed her the situation in clean, simple lines. 40 hostiles on the hull, 290 more on a survey vessel in low orbit, 301 ships in the sector total, belonging to something that called itself the Velhari Combine, a name Hale had never heard, which told her everything she needed to know about how long she had slept. The enemy she had been buried to escape was gone. Whoever these new diggers were, they had found her grave by accident, and they had come to sell her for scrap. Hale lay still for one more moment, and let the weight of it land. 9,000 years. The number meant nothing and everything. Everyone she had ever known outside the ship was dust. Her world, her admiralty, her whole species, gone, or scattered, or hiding the way she had been hiding, sleeping in tombs across the dark. She did not weep. There would be time for that later, or there would not, and either way it would not help the 212 people now waking in the cradles below her, who would look to her the moment they opened their eyes. A captain grieves on her own time. Hale folded the loss away into the cold, quiet place she kept for exactly that, the same place she had kept every loss of the old war, and she rose. The bridge of the Aegis Far Iron came alive around her, station by station, as the rest of the crew woke in their own cradles below and climbed up through the waking ship to take their places. 212 of them, a full battle crew, hand-picked 9,000 years ago, the kind of people you only bury if you mean to need them badly someday. The bridge lit amber and gold, and the great viewport, which had been buried under 300 meters of stone, cleared itself with a sound like a held breath releasing, and showed her the pit, and the floodlights, and the small frightened shapes of the Velhari scattering across her hull. She watched them run. She felt no anger. Anger was a thing for people with time to waste, and Hale had been a soldier long enough to know that the creatures on her hull were workers, not warriors, and that killing workers won nothing. So she did the thing that her training, and her century, and her whole vanished civilization had taught her to do first. She talked. The Aegis Far Iron put a hail across every frequency in the sector, in the Velhari tongue, which the ship's old translation engines had quietly learned from 40 days of listening to the dig crews argue over their drills. The voice that came out of 300 Velhari speakers was calm and even, and human, and it said this: Velhari Excavation Crew. This vessel is a commissioned warship of the Human Admiralty. You have breached a sealed military site and begun the dismantling of an active hull with crew aboard. Cease all work. Withdraw your people from the surface of this ship. Return to your survey vessel. No harm will come to you if you comply. This is the only warning you will receive. Overseer Korath heard the hail and felt his blood go cold, and then he did the thing that captains do when they are frightened and proud and do not want their crews to see the first. He laughed. He laughed loud enough for the open channel to carry it. He told the human ship that it was a relic, a museum piece, 9,000 years out of date, that whatever wonders it had once been able to do were rust and ash now, that the Velhari Combine commanded weapons the Human Admiralty had never dreamed of. He told it that the proper response to a talking antique was to weigh it and sell it. He ordered his crews back to work, and to the survey ship in orbit, the cutter Veshin's Edge, he sent a private burst asking it to bring its guns to bear on the pit, just in case the museum piece had any teeth left to bear. The cutter agreed, laughing too, because the joke was good, and the Combine loved a good joke. Veshin's Edge slid into a low pass over Site 92, and trained its forward batteries on the glowing shape in the pit. 300 Velhari watched the feed and waited to see the old human warship learn its place. On the bridge of the Aegis Far Iron, Captain Hale listened to the laughter, and she understood it completely, because 9,000 years ago she had laughed the same way at enemies she thought she had already beaten. She did not take it personally. She turned to the woman at the sensor station, a sharp-eyed officer named Priya Sand, who had been awake for 3 minutes and was already reading the Velhari fleet like a book, and asked her for a read on the cutter's weapons. Sand gave it to her in numbers, the yield, the range, the cycle time, and then added, dry, that the cutter's entire forward battery would do roughly as much to the cold iron's field as a thrown stone. Hale nodded. She had expected nothing else. She simply noted, with the flat patience of a professional, that the warning had been given and refused, and that everything which followed was now a thing the Velhari had chosen. She turned to her weapons officer, a steady man named Ash Corwin, who had been at his station, by his own reckoning, for less than 4 minutes after a 9,000-year sleep. She asked him for a status on the spinal array. Corwin ran his hands across his board and told her the spine was warm and willing, and that the first shot would be ready in 90 seconds. Hale nodded. She told him she did not want the cutter destroyed. She wanted it disarmed. There was a difference, and the difference was the whole reason the Admiralty had picked her to command a tomb ship, because a captain who only knew how to destroy was a captain who could not be trusted with the last warships of a dying species. Corwin had served with her in the Old War, in the years before the long sleep, and he knew exactly what she meant, and he knew exactly how hard it was. Killing a ship was easy. Anyone could kill a ship. Reaching across the dark and taking the teeth out of a hostile hull without taking its life, that was a thing that required a gunner who could thread a needle at 1,000 kilometers, and a captain with the nerve to ask for it when the easy thing was simply to fire and be done. Corwin had spent the last years of the Old War learning to do exactly that, beside this exact captain, and the 9,000-year sleep had not taken it out of his hands. He warmed the spine and waited for the 90 seconds, and he did not blink. 90 seconds passed. The cutter Veshin's Edge finished its lazy turn and opened fire on the pit, a full forward salvo, the kind of barrage that would have cracked a Velhari frigate in half. The energy of it lit the dead gray sky of Site 92 like a second sun. 300 Velhari cheered. The HFY iron did not move, and it did not break. A shimmer ran across its scarred hull, a field the Combine's instruments could not name and would spend the next decade failing to reproduce, and the cutter's entire salvo splashed against it and went nowhere. Not a scratch, not a scuff on 9,000 years of scars. The amber light in the open ports did not so much as flicker. Then the spine of the human warship spoke once. A single lance of light reached up out of the pit, crossed the distance to the cutter in less than the time it took a Velhari heart to beat, and removed the forward weapons section of Veshin's edge as cleanly as a surgeon removes a tumor. The cutter's guns, its targeting arrays, its forward batteries, all of it, gone, sheared away in a flash of vapor. The rest of the ship was untouched. Its crew lived. Its engines ran. It simply no longer had any teeth, and it tumbled away from its pass over the pit, spinning, blind, while 290 Velhari aboard it screamed into their channels and got no answer but their own echo. The cheering across the Combine stopped. On the bridge of the HFY iron, Hale watched the disarmed cutter limp away and felt nothing she would have called satisfaction. She put the hail out again, the same calm voice, the same simple words. Withdraw your people from the surface of this ship. Return to your survey vessel. No harm will come to you if you comply. And this time, Overseer Korath, looking at the smoking ruin of where Veshin's edge had kept its guns, did not laugh. He pulled his crews off the hull. He pulled them fast, and he counted them as they came, all 90, scrambling up the cables and into the lifters and away from the glowing shape that had been a museum piece 90 seconds ago and was something else now. He got every one of them clear. The human ship let him. It tracked each fleeing Velhari with weapons that could have erased them at any instant, and it harmed not one. It only watched, the way a wolf watches a deer leave its territory, with no hunger and no mercy, just the cold patience of a thing that has decided the matter is already settled. Young Tessic was the last off the hull. He climbed into the final lifter with his deep sensor unit still clutched against his chest, the unit that had read the breathing and known, before anyone, what it meant. As the lifter rose past the open weapon ports, the boy looked into one of the amber glowing eyes of the HFY iron, and for one impossible instant, he had the certain feeling that something inside was looking back at him, calm and patient and unspeakably old, and that it had decided, for reasons of its own, to let him live. He never forgot the feeling. He would tell his hatchlings about it decades later, and they would not believe him, and it would not matter, because Tessic knew what he had seen. He had looked into the eye of the thing the Combine had spent 9,000 years calling scrap, and the scrap had looked back and chosen mercy. When the last lifter cleared the rim of the pit, the HFY iron moved for the first time in 9,000 years. It did not climb out of the hole. It rose out of it, 300 meters of stone and dust and tomb seal, sloughing off its flanks like water, the great scarred hull lifting straight up into the dead gray sky on engines that made no sound a Velhari could hear and through no flame a Velhari could see. It was 900 meters of cold iron, and it climbed out of its own grave with the slow inevitability of a sunrise, and every Velhari instrument in the sector locked onto it at once and reported, in cold numbers, that the thing they had dug up to sell for scrap massed more than their entire reclamation fleet combined. Korath watched it rise from the cockpit of his fleeing lifter, and he did the math that every Velhari in the sector was now doing, and the math was very simple. 300 Combine ships, built to strip worlds, against one human warship that had shrugged off a full salvo and disarmed a cutter with a single shot it had not even seemed to aim. He keyed his channel to the Combine's regional command, the great administrative hub 3 jumps away that managed the whole reclamation effort, and he made his report in a voice that had stopped laughing entirely. He told them what he had found. He told them what it had done. He told them, because he was an honest captain even when honesty cost him, that he had been warned twice and had refused twice, and that the warship had spared his crews both times, and that he did not understand why, and that the not understanding frightened him more than the guns. Regional Command did not believe him. That was the thing about a Combine that had spent 9,000 years certain that humanity was dead. It had built its whole understanding of the galaxy on that certainty, and a thing you have been certain of for 9,000 years is not undone by one frightened overseer's report. Command told Korath he had panicked. Command told him he had mistaken a salvage accident for a warship. Command told him to regroup his reclamation fleet, all 300 ships, and bring the human relic in for study, by force if it would not come quietly, and to stop embarrassing the Combine with talk of dead things that woke up. So the Velhari gathered their fleet, 300 ships, drawn from across the sector, every hull the reclamation effort could spare, converging on the dead gray world called Site 92 to take possession of one 9,000-year-old human warship that had asked them, twice, and very politely, to leave it alone. Captain Imogen Hale watched them gather on her long-range plot, 300 contacts blooming across the dark, and she understood exactly what was coming, and she felt the old familiar weight settle onto her shoulders, the weight she had carried into every battle of a war that was 9,000 years dead. She turned to her crew, 212 people who had gone to sleep certain they would wake to a galaxy that needed them, and found instead a galaxy that had forgotten them and come to dig them up. And she told them, in the plain, flat voice of a captain who has done this before and knows exactly how much it costs, that the enemy did not believe in them yet, and that belief was a thing the Aegis Far Iron was very, very good at teaching. She did not tell them they would all walk away. She was not that kind of captain, and they were not that kind of crew. She told them the truth, which was that the ship would hold, that the ship had always held, that the Aegis Far Iron had been built and buried and crewed for exactly this hour, and that whatever it cost, the cold iron would not bend in the dark. Then she gave the order to clear the dead world and take the ship up to meet them. The Velhari fleet arrived in 2 days, and the Aegis Far Iron was waiting for it exactly where it said it would be. 300 ships dropped out of jump in a wide arc around the dead world, a textbook envelopment, the kind of formation the Combine had used to herd 1,000 fleeing salvage targets into the maw of a strip yard. They expected the human warship to run. They had built their whole approach around the warship running, because that was what cornered things did, and the Combine had 9,000 years of catalogued certainty that humanity, in the end, was a thing that had run from the galaxy and lost. The Aegis Far Iron did not run. It hung above the gray world, 900 meters of cold iron lit amber and white, and it let them come, and when the encircling arc had closed to engagement range, the human ship sent one more hail, the same calm voice, the same simple offer: withdraw. No harm will come to you if you comply. The Velhari fleet commander, a decorated officer named Vol Thren, who had never lost an engagement in 40 years of reclamation work, heard the hail and gave the order to fire all 300 ships at once. The volley that crossed the dark toward the Aegis Far Iron was the largest concentration of firepower the Velhari Combine had ever brought against a single target. It would have vaporized a small moon. Vol Thren watched it go, 300 lances of energy converging on one point, and allowed himself the brief professional pleasure of a problem about to be solved. The human ship raised its field and the volley died against it, all of it, the whole moon-killing weight of the Combine's fleet, splashing across a barrier 9,000 years old and leaving nothing behind but light. And then the Aegis Far Iron went to work, and the Velhari learned, in the space of the next 11 minutes, the difference between a fleet that strips worlds and a ship that fights them. It did not destroy them. That was the thing Vol Thren would never be able to explain to the Combine, the thing that would keep him awake for the rest of his career. The human ship moved through his envelopment like a blade through smoke, and one by one, it took the fight out of his ships without taking their lives. It sheared away weapon mounts with surgical lances of light. It crushed engine sections with fields that reached out and squeezed. It blinded targeting arrays and burned out sensor masts and left 300 Velhari hulls drifting, powerless, disarmed, intact, their crews alive and screaming and utterly unable to do a single thing about the cold iron ship that moved among them like a patient teacher correcting a room full of children. Volthren watched it happen from the bridge of his flagship, and he was a good enough commander to see, even through the disaster, that he was being taught something. The human ship was not fighting the way an enemy fought. An enemy that outclassed you this badly would simply kill you, fast, to be done with it, the way the Combine itself killed the rare salvage target that turned and fought. This ship was doing something harder and stranger. It was being careful. It was taking 300 ships apart with the precision of a watchmaker, sparing every life, leaving every crew to limp home and tell the story. And Volthren understood, with a cold, sick certainty, that the human ship wanted them to live, that the whole point of the exercise was the telling. It was not trying to win the battle. It had already won the battle. It was trying to send a message, and the message was the survivors. 11 minutes, 300 ships, not one Velhari death. When it was over, the entire reclamation fleet hung dead in the dark around the gray world, and the Aegis Far Iron drifted at the center of the ruin it had made, undamaged, unhurried, and put out its hail one final time. You were warned 3 times. You were spared 3 times. Tell your Combine what you saw here. Tell them the humans are awake. And then it turned and let 300 crippled ships limp home to carry the news, and it did not leave the system, not yet, because the human ship was listening for something, and it had not heard it. The Combine did not take the news well. The story that came back from Site 92 should have ended the matter. A relic that could disarm 300 ships in 11 minutes was not a thing to be dug up and sold. It was a thing to be left alone, given a wide berth, treated with the wary respect a sane species gives to a force it cannot match. Volthren said exactly that, in his report, in plain words, and recommended that the Combine declare Site 92 and its warship a closed zone and never go near it again. But the Velhari Combine was 9,000 years deep in a single certainty, and certainties that old do not die from one defeat. They die from a second one, or a third, or they do not die at all, and instead they curdle into something worse. The Combine's high administration read Volthren's report and decided that the human ship had gotten lucky, that the reclamation fleet had been the wrong tool, that what was needed was not salvage hulls but warships, real warships, the Combine's military arm, which had been built to fight things and which had never in its history lost a fight it had chosen. There was a vote in the high administration. It was not close. The administrators who had grown rich on human metal could not bring themselves to accept that human metal could fight back, because to accept it was to admit that 9,000 years of certainty had been wrong, and to admit that was to admit that everything the Combine had built itself upon was built on a lie. So they did what frightened, powerful things always do when the truth is unbearable. They decided the truth was an insult, and they resolved to answer it with force. They would not be lectured by a relic. They would not be spared by scrap. They would take the human ship apart with their war fleet, and they would hang its cold iron name at the bottom of the catalog where it belonged, in the place reserved for resources, for tonnage, for things that had once thought they were more than a price. There was one voice in the high administration that argued against it, an old administrator named Sel Voran, who had spent her long career studying the human worlds the Combine stripped, stood up in the chamber and told them they were making the worst mistake in the Combine's history. She said she had read the human records, the ones the reclamation crews threw away as worthless, because they were only words, and words could not be sold. She said the humans had not vanished from the galaxy because they were weak. She said the records spoke of a war, a long, terrible war against something the humans would not name, and of a decision the human admiralty had made at the end of it, a decision to bury their best ships in sleep, and that no species buries its best ships unless it expects to need them again. She told the administration that the Aegis Far Iron was not a relic, and not a museum piece, and not a salvage accident. It was a sentinel. It had been left in the ground on purpose, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and the only sane response to waking one was to apologize and back away and pray they had not woken it for nothing. The administration did not listen to Sel Voran. They were 9,000 years into a certainty, and the certainty was more comfortable than the truth, and so they voted her down and sent her home and went on planning their war fleet. But Selvorin was right, and she would be proven right within the month, and when she was, the administration would remember that she had stood in that chamber and told them, plainly, what the cold iron was, and that they had laughed at her too. There was a great deal of laughing in the Velhari Combine in those weeks, and a great deal of it would have to be unlearned, and the unlearning would be paid for in a coin the administration had not yet imagined it would have to spend. They did not understand yet that the human ship had not won by luck. They did not understand that it had been holding back. They had seen the Aegis Far Iron spare 300 lives and mistaken mercy for weakness, and that mistake was the kind that a species only gets to make once. So the Combine prepared its war fleet, and while it prepared, the thing that the Aegis Far Iron had really woken up for came out of the dark on the far side of the sector, and the Combine learned that there were worse things in the galaxy than a human warship, and that one of them had been waiting 9,000 years too. It came to a Combine border world called Heshet, a green and living planet of 40 million Velhari, and the first sign of it was that the planet's outer beacons stopped answering. Then the orbital stations stopped answering. Then, on the long-range plots 3 jumps away, the world itself began to change color, slowly, from green to a deep wet gray, as if something were spreading across it from pole to pole. The Combine sent a frigate to investigate. The frigate stopped answering too. The thing had no name in any Velhari catalog, because the Velhari catalogs were 9,000 years young, and the thing was older than that by a margin that did not bear thinking about. It was alive, in the way a tide is alive, in the way a wildfire is alive. It was a fleet and a creature at the same time, a vast drifting mass of organic ships that were not built but grown, hulls of dense fibrous flesh and bone-white armor, and it moved through space by consuming what it found. It ate metal. It ate worlds. It ate the ships that came to fight it, and folded their materials into new growth, more hulls, more mass, more hunger, and it had been crossing the dark between the stars for longer than the Velhari Combine had existed, eating its slow, patient way across the galaxy, one world at a time. The humans had a name for it. The humans had fought it. The war that humanity had been losing 9,000 years ago, the war that had driven the Admiralty to bury its best ships under 300 meters of stone, had not been a war against another empire. It had been a war against this, the thing that fed. The humans had called it the Maw, for lack of any better word, and they had not lost to it exactly. They had simply run out of time to beat it, and so they had done the only thing left to do. They had buried their teeth and gone to sleep, and bet everything on a single terrible hope, that when the Maw came back, someone would dig up the cold iron in time. Hale knew the Maw the way you know a thing you have spent your whole life fighting. She had seen it eat a human world once, at the start of the old war, before anyone understood what it was. She had been a junior officer then, young and certain, and she had watched the Grey come down on a colony of 8 million and take it apart in a single day, and she had learned, in that day, the lesson that shaped the rest of her life and the rest of her species. The Maw could not be reasoned with, because it did not want anything a mind could understand. It did not hate. It did not conquer. It did not even hunger the way a living thing hungers, with desire, with appetite. It simply fed, the way a fire burns, the way the cold spreads, an old blind process that had been running since before the first star the humans ever named, and it would keep running until something stopped it, or until there was nothing left in the galaxy to feed it, and those were the only 2 ways it ended. The humans had spent their last centuries learning how to be the something that stopped it. They had built weapons and lost them. They had built fleets and watched them absorbed, and slowly, at terrible cost, they had learned the one truth that mattered, the truth that the cold iron was built around. The Maw had a heart, for all its vastness, for all the worlds it had eaten. The whole gray tide was driven by a single, dense old core, the original seed of the thing, and if you could reach that core and unmake it, the entire tide died with it, every grown hull, every swarming hand, all at once. The trouble was that the core was always buried at the center of the largest mass the Maw could grow, behind every hull it owned, in the one place a ship could not reach without being swallowed. The humans had built exactly one kind of weapon that could be carried into that place and fired. They had called it the Far Iron, and they had built it into the spine of their best ships, and they had understood, every time, exactly what it cost to use it. That was the secret the tombs had really kept. Not treasure, not relics, a warning, and a weapon, set to wake together. The Admiralty had known, 9,000 years ago, that the Maw was not a thing that could be killed in a single war. It was too old, too vast, too patient. It would withdraw when it was hurt, and return when it had grown, on a cycle longer than most civilizations lasted, and the only species that had ever made it bleed was the one that had run out of time. So the humans had done the hardest thing a dying people can do. They had planned for a future they would not see. They had built ships that could kill the Maw, and crewed them with people willing to sleep through the death of everything they loved, and buried them across the dark, and set them to wake the next time the hunger came. It was the longest, loneliest, most patient act of defiance in the history of the galaxy, and the Velhari had stumbled into the middle of it with a salvage quota and a joke. There had been survivors at Heshet, a few. A handful of small ships had been in the outer system when the Grey came. Freighters and a mail runner and a single science vessel studying the world's third moon, and they had watched the whole thing happen from a distance and lived because the Maw had not yet noticed them. Their accounts reached the Combine before the High Administration had finished pretending nothing was wrong, and the accounts were worse than any number. They described a tide that came out of the dark with no fleet and no formation, that did not hail, and did not threaten, and did not negotiate, that simply arrived and began to feed. They described the orbital stations being wrapped and folded and absorbed, the metal of them flowing into the gray mass and coming back out as new growth. They described the world below going dark city by city, not in fire, but in silence, as the gray reached down and took everything that could be taken. And they described the last thing, the thing that no Velhari who heard it ever forgot, which was that the Maw made no sound at all. A war makes a sound. A disaster makes a sound. This made none. It ate a world of 40 million the way a tide eats a sandcastle, patiently, completely, and without the slightest interest in the fact that anyone had ever lived there. The captain of the science vessel, an old Velhari named Doan Resh, who had spent her whole life studying dead worlds and now had watched a living one die, sent a final transmission before she ran for the jump line. She said she did not know what the thing was. She said it was older than anything in the Combine's archives, older than the Combine itself, older perhaps than the human worlds the reclamation crews had been stripping for 9,000 years. And she said, in the last line of her message, the line that the High Administration tried and failed to keep out of the record, that if the humans had built ships to fight this, then the Combine had spent 9,000 years selling the only weapons in the galaxy that could have saved it. The Velhari did not know any of this connected. The Velhari only knew that a living world of 40 million had gone gray and silent in 19 hours, and that the thing which had done it was now turning, slow and vast and patient, toward the heart of the Combine. Captain Imogen Hale knew the moment it happened. The Aegis Far Iron had been listening to the whole sector since it woke, waiting for exactly this, and when the beacons at Heshet went dark, the ship recognized the pattern instantly, the way a survivor recognizes the footstep of the thing that killed her family. Hale stood on her bridge and watched the wet gray stain spread across the long-range plot, and the crew watched her face, and saw on it something they had not seen when 300 Velhari ships came to take them apart. They saw fear. Not panic. Fear, the clean, cold, useful kind, the fear of someone who knows exactly what she is looking at and exactly how bad it is. This was the thing they had been buried for, not the Combine, not the salvage crews. The Maw had come back, on schedule, 9,000 years late, and the Aegis Far Iron was awake to meet it, one ship of cold iron against a hunger that ate worlds, and there was no fleet behind it, no admiralty, no human civilization left at all. There was only Hale, and 212 people, and a ship that had been built to hold the line for a species that no longer existed. Hale gave the order to break orbit and move to intercept. Ash Corwin, at the weapons board, asked her the question the whole crew was thinking, the question about whether they should warn the Combine, the species that had just spent 2 days trying to sell them for scrap. Hale answered it without hesitation. The Combine had 40 million dead at Heshet and did not yet know what had killed them. They would learn, and when they learned, they would throw their shiny new war fleet at the Maw, the same way they had thrown their salvage hulls at the Aegis Far Iron, with confidence and certainty and 9,000 years of never having lost, and the Maw would eat them and grow fat and keep coming. Priya Sand, at the sensor station, ran the numbers on the Maw's growth and gave them to the bridge flat and cold. At its current rate of feeding, she said, the thing would double its mass with every living world it took. Heshet had been the first in 9,000 years. There would be a second, and a fourth, and an eighth, and the curve climbed from there into figures that ended civilizations. If the Maw were not stopped soon, while it was still small, while it had eaten only one world, it would not be stopped at all. The whole sector had a window, and the window was closing, and the only thing in the galaxy that knew how to close it was the ship the Combine had just declared an enemy. So the cold iron ship turned away from the gathering Combine warfleet and toward the spreading gray horror that had killed Heshet, and Captain Hale opened a channel to the Velhari High Administration, the same Combine that had laughed at her and shot at her and come to dig her up. And she told them, in her calm, flat voice, that she knew what had killed their world, that she had fought it before, that they could not beat it alone, and that the museum piece they had been so eager to sell was about to become the only thing standing between the Velhari Combine and the end of everything they had ever catalogued. She did not expect them to believe her. They had not believed Vol Thren. They would not believe a relic. But Hale had learned a long time ago that you give the warning anyway, even when you know it will be refused, because the warning is not for the enemy, the warning is for the record, so that afterward, when the cold iron was the only thing left holding the line, no one could say the humans had not asked them, first, and very politely, to let them help. The Combine did exactly what Hale had said it would do. The Velhari High Administration heard her warning, and they did not believe it, and instead they sent their warfleet to the wrong place. They sent it to Site 92, to finish the job their salvage crews had failed. 60 warships, the pride of the Combine's military arm, real fighting hulls bristling with the weapons the reclamation fleet had lacked, jumped into the dead gray system to take the human ship by force. They found an empty orbit and a hole in the ground where a tomb had been, and while they sat there confused, the wet gray stain on the long-range plot grew, and turned at last toward a Combine world of 200 million, called Tarn Veled. That was when the High Administration finally understood that the relic had not been lying. The thing that had eaten Heshet was real, and it was hungry, and it was coming for one of the great worlds of the Combine. The administration recalled its warfleet from Site 92 and flung it across the sector to Tarn Veled, 60 warships racing to defend 200 million Velhari from a horror they still did not have a name for, and they did it with confidence, because the Combine's military had never lost, and a fleet that has never lost cannot imagine that it might. The administration also, in the cold private rooms where powerful things make the decisions they are ashamed of, sent a second order, a quiet one. The warfleet was to defend Tarn Veled, yes, but if the human ship appeared, the warfleet was also to seize it, in the confusion of the battle, while it was occupied with the gray horror. The administration could not let go of the prize even now. It had spent 9,000 years certain that human metal belonged to the Combine, and a single warning, a single eaten world, was not enough to break a certainty that old. They wanted the cold iron. They wanted it more than they wanted to understand it, and that wanting would very nearly cost them everything. The Aegis Far Iron arrived at Tarn Veled 4 hours ahead of them. Hale had read the Maw's movement and known where it would strike, the way she had known 1,000 times in the old war, and she had pushed the cold iron ship harder than any Velhari hull could have survived to get there first. She arrived to find Tarn Veled still green, still living, 200 million Velhari going about their lives under a sky that had not yet turned gray, and beyond the world's outer moons, filling a quarter of the sky, the maw. It was bigger than Heshet had been. It had eaten a living world and grown, and now it was a drifting continent of fibrous hulls and bone-white armor, thousands of organic ships moving as one mass, a tide of hunger the size of a small fleet of moons. Hale looked at it on her viewport and felt the old fear and set it aside, the way she had learned to, because fear was useful only until the shooting started, and then it was just wait. She turned to her crew, 212 people who had been buried to fight this exact thing, and she told them the truth she always told them. The ship would hold, the cold iron would not bend, and then she took the HFY iron in alone, against a hunger that ate worlds, and the maw, for the first time in 9,000 years, met something with teeth. The humans had learned, in the old war, that the maw could not be beaten the way a fleet was beaten, because it had no command, no morale, no fear, nothing to break. You could not make it retreat. You could only burn it faster than it could grow, and the only thing humanity had ever built that could burn it fast enough was the cold iron ship. The HFY iron drove into the heart of the gray tide and lit its spinal array, and the lance of light that had disarmed a cutter with one shot now swept through the maw like a scythe through grain, and 100 organic hulls burst and burned and died at once. The maw responded the only way it knew. It swarmed. Thousands of grown hulls peeled off the main mass and threw themselves at the human ship, not firing weapons, because the maw had no weapons, only itself, its own mass, its own hunger. It tried to wrap the HFY iron in flesh and bone and squeeze and consume, the way it had consumed every ship that had ever come against it. It crashed against the cold iron in a wave that would have buried any vessel the Velhari had ever built, and the cold iron held. The field that had shrugged off 300 Velhari guns now shrugged off the maw, and where the field touched the grasping hulls it burned them, and Hale's gunners worked their boards with the steady rhythm of people who had done this 1,000 times before they slept, and the HFY iron carved a glowing wound through the center of the tide and out the far side, leaving a trail of dead and burning growth, 900 kilometers long. On the bridge, Priya Sand tracked the kill rate and the growth rate side by side, 2 climbing numbers, and her face was grim, because she could already see what Hale knew. The ship was burning the maw faster than any fleet in history could have, and it was not fast enough. The tide grew back behind the wound almost as quickly as the cold iron cut it, and a single ship, even this ship, could not be everywhere, and the maw did not have to win. It only had to outlast. The Velhari war fleet arrived in the middle of it. 60 warships dropped out of jump above Tarn Velid and found a battle already underway. One human ship against a horror that filled a quarter of the sky, and Fleet Commander Vol Thren, who had been given command of the military arm precisely because he was the one Velhari who had seen the HFY iron fight and lived, looked at the gray tide and understood, all at once, everything the human captain had tried to tell them. He understood that the thing in front of him could not be reasoned with. He understood that it had eaten Heshet and would eat Tarn Velid and would not stop. And he understood, watching the cold iron ship carve through it, that the relic he had brought 300 salvage hulls to capture was the only thing in the galaxy that could hurt it. He also had the administration's quiet order in his ear: seize the human ship in the confusion. Vol Thren read that order, and he looked at the gray horror eating its way toward 200 million of his own people, and he looked at the single cold iron ship throwing itself into the heart of that horror to stop it, and he made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He deleted the order. He did not acknowledge it. He did not pass it to his captains. He decided, alone, on the bridge of his flagship, that whatever the Combine wanted, he was done laughing at the humans, and he was done pretending the cold iron was a prize. It was an ally. It was, right now, the only ally his species had. And he took his 60 warships into the fight beside it. It went badly for the Velhari, the way Hale had known it would. The Combine's warships were built to fight other ships, to trade fire across a clean line of battle, and the maw did not fight that way. It did not fire back. It swarmed. It wrapped a Velhari cruiser in a dozen grown hulls and crushed it, and absorbed it before its crew could even understand what was happening, and the absorbed metal became new growth, more hulls, more mass, the maw eating the fleet that had come to fight it, and growing stronger with every kill. In 9 minutes the Combine lost 11 warships, and the surviving 49 began to break, because they had never lost, and a fleet that has never lost has no idea how to keep fighting when it starts to. That was the moment the Aegis Far Iron stopped fighting the Maw and started fighting for the Velhari. Hale saw the Combine fleet breaking and made a decision that no Velhari aboard those ships would ever forget. She put the cold iron ship between the war fleet and the tide. She wrapped the Aegis Far Iron's field outward, wide, a shield 900 meters of warship had no business projecting, and she covered the broken Velhari fleet with it, soaked the Maw's swarming hulls against her own armor, so that the Velhari behind her could pull back and reform. The cold iron took the weight of the whole tide on its scarred flanks and held, and behind it, sheltered, 49 Combine warships that had come to either capture or be saved by this exact ship, got the breath they needed to stop running and start fighting again. There was one moment in that hour that Vol Thren would carry with him until he died. One of his ships, a light cruiser called the Sorn Light, had been caught at the edge of the swarm when the fleet began to break, half wrapped in grown hulls, its engines already failing, 300 Velhari aboard it screaming for help that no one in the breaking fleet could give. Vol Thren had written it off. He had done the brutal arithmetic that every commander learns to do, and the Sorn Light was already lost, and there was nothing to be gained by losing a second ship trying to reach it. He had given the order to leave them. The Aegis Far Iron did not leave them. The cold iron ship broke off its own carved through the tide, turned, and drove straight into the swarm that was eating the Sorn Light, and it peeled the grown hulls off the dying cruiser, one by one, with the same surgical lances it had used to disarm a fleet, close enough that the Velhari aboard could see the scars on the human hull through their viewports. It cleared the Sorn Light. It put its own field around the crippled cruiser and held the swarm off until the Velhari engines caught and the ship limped clear, and then it returned to the fight, all of it taking less than 90 seconds, all of it for 300 strangers that the Combine's own commander had already given up for dead. Vol Thren watched it happen, and he understood, in that moment, the exact difference between his species and the one in the cold iron ship. The Combine did the arithmetic. The humans did not. The humans had decided, somewhere in their long-vanished history, that the arithmetic was the enemy, and they had built a ship, and crewed it, and buried it, for 9,000 years on the strength of that decision, and now that decision had just reached across the dark and saved 300 Velhari that no Velhari would have saved. Vol Thren understood what the human ship was doing, and he did not waste the gift. He rallied his fleet behind the cold iron shield. He turned 49 confused, terrified, defeated warships into a fighting line again, and he learned, fast, watching the Aegis Far Iron, that the Maw burned. He focused his fire the way the human ship focused its fire, not spread across the tide but concentrated, burning the gray hulls faster than they could grow, and slowly, the 200 million Velhari on the green world below stopped being a meal and started being a thing that might, against all the Combine's 9,000 years of certainty, actually be defended. Hale spoke to him across the open channel, calm and steady through the chaos, and she taught him the war the way a veteran teaches a recruit, in short, flat sentences with no wasted words. Concentrate fire. Never let it wrap you. Burn the growth, not the swarm. Keep your line behind mine. And Vol Thren, 40 years a commander and never once a student, listened to the cold iron captain and learned more in 9 minutes than he had learned in his entire career. For a while it looked, to the Velhari, as though it might be enough. The combined fire of the cold iron ship and the rallied war fleet was burning the gray tide back, hull by hull, and the line held, and Tarn Velid stayed green beneath them. The Velhari crews, who had never in 9,000 years stood against something like this, and never expected to live through the trying, began to feel the first dangerous edge of hope. They saw the Maw shrinking. They saw the dead gray hulls drifting away from the fight, cooling, lifeless. They saw the human ship at the center of it all, untouched, tireless, and they let themselves believe that the worst was behind them. Hale knew better. Priya Sand had the numbers, and the numbers did not lie. The tide was shrinking, yes, but it was not dying. Every hull they burned, the core grew back, slower now, but it grew, drawing on the mass it had stolen from Heshet, from the absorbed Velhari ships, from 9,000 years of patient feeding. The fleet and the cold iron together could hold the line for an hour, for two, for as long as the gunners could stand at their boards. But they could not win, because winning meant killing the heart, and the heart was untouched and unreachable behind a wall of grown hulls that no fleet in the galaxy could punch through. The Velhari were fighting the hands of the thing. The hands could be burned forever and the thing would not die. Hale had learned that lesson at the cost of 100 ships in the old war, and she was not going to relearn it now, not with 200 million lives in the balance and a window that was already starting to close. It was not enough. Hale knew it was not enough. She had fought the Maw before, and she knew the cold arithmetic of it, that you could burn the tide all day and it would keep coming as long as the core was alive. The dense old heart of the thing, the original mass that had been crossing the dark since before the Velhari learned to count. The swarming hulls were just the tide's hands. To kill the Maw, you had to kill the heart, and the heart was buried at the center of the gray continent, behind a million grasping hulls, in the one place a single ship could not reach without being swallowed whole. 9,000 years ago, the human admiralty had built a weapon for exactly that. It was the reason the Aegis Far Iron had been buried and not scrapped, the reason it had been crewed with the best the admiralty had, the reason a captain like Hale had been chosen to sleep in the cold iron for as long as it took. Deep in the spine of the ship, behind the reactor, there was a thing the old crews had called the Far Iron itself, the weapon that gave the ship its name, a single shot that could reach into the heart of the Maw and unmake it. It had been built to be fired once. It had been built to be fired from inside the tide, at point-blank range, against the core, because that was the only way to be sure. And it had been built knowing what that would cost the ship that fired it. Hale called up the Far Iron status on her board and read the numbers she had read 1,000 times in training 9,000 years ago, and they had not changed. The weapon would fire, the shot would kill the Maw's heart, and the ship that carried it into the tide to make that shot would not be coming back out, because no field ever built, not even the cold irons, could hold against the whole weight of the Maw at the range the shot required. To fire the Far Iron was to drive the Aegis Far Iron into the center of the hunger and hold there, surrounded, swallowed, long enough to aim and fire, and a ship that did that did not survive it. 212 people had been buried under 300 meters of stone for 9,000 years for exactly this moment. They had all known, going to sleep, what the cold iron was for. Hale turned to her crew, and she did not have to explain it, because every one of them had read the same numbers she had, in the same training, before the same long sleep. She only asked them, in her plain flat voice, if they were ready, and 212 people who had given up their whole world and their whole time to wait for this hour told their captain, in 212 voices, that they were. Ash Corwin, at the weapons board, the man who had spent the last years of a dead war learning to take the teeth from a ship without taking its life, looked at his captain and said only that the spine was warm and the Far Iron was ready, and that it would be an honor to make the last shot count. Priya Sand plotted the run to the core, the deepest, worst run any of them had ever charted, and read it out without a tremor in her voice. The bridge of the Aegis Far Iron was the calmest place in the entire battle, 212 people doing their jobs in the amber light, ready, because they had always known, because a crew you bury for 9,000 years is a crew that has already made its peace. In the last minutes before the run, the crew of the Aegis Far Iron did the small human things that people do when they know the shape of the hour they are walking into. They did not make speeches. Hale had served with people who made speeches, and she had buried most of them, and she had learned that a crew worth keeping does not need a speech. They needed a moment, and she gave it to them. 90 seconds of quiet, while the ship steadied on its line, and they used it. Ash Corwin checked his board one more time, not because it needed checking, but because the checking was a kind of prayer for a man who did not pray. Priya Sand looked at the green world below, at the 200 million Velhari going about their lives under a sky they did not know was about to be saved, and she thought, not for the first time, that it was a strange thing to die for strangers, and a stranger thing still that it did not feel strange at all. Somewhere below the bridge, in the long quiet corridors of the cold iron ship, 200 people who would never be named in any catalog took their stations and held them. The engineers and the medics and the people who kept the reactor warm, every one of them awake now after 9,000 years, every one of them having made the same peace, every one of them ready. Hale walked the bridge once, slowly, the way she always had before a fight that mattered, and she looked each of her officers in the eye, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the look did not say better. They had been together a long time, by the only clock that counted, the clock of shared danger, which runs faster than any other. They had fought the old war together, and lost it together, and agreed, together, to sleep through the death of everything, rather than let the cold iron be the last thing humanity gave up. And now they were awake, and the hour had come, and Hale looked at them and saw that not one of them wanted to be anywhere else, and that was the only speech a crew like that ever needed. Hale opened a channel to Vol Thren. She told the Velhari commander what she was about to do. She told him to pull his fleet back, all of it, to the far side of the green world, and to keep it there, because when the far iron fired, the death of the Maw's heart would take everything near it, and she did not want a single Velhari ship close enough to share the ship's last shot. Vol Thren understood. He had spent 2 days laughing at this ship, and 4 hours being saved by it, and now he understood, completely, what it was, and what it had always been, and what it was about to become. He tried, once, to argue. He told her there had to be another way, that the Combine would build whatever she needed, that she did not have to do this. And Hale, in her calm, flat voice, told him the truth, that 9,000 years had not changed. There was no other way. There never had been. That was why the ship had a name like a shield, and why it had been buried with the best crew the Admiralty could find, and why she had agreed, at 29 years old, to sleep through the end of her world. The cold iron had always been meant for this. She was only the one lucky enough to carry it the last few meters. He asked the human captain her name. In 2 days of trying to capture her ship, and 4 hours of fighting beside it, no Velhari had ever known her name. She told him, Captain Imogen Hale, of the Aegis Far Iron, of the human admiralty, of a species that the Combine had been certain, for 9,000 years, was dead. She told him to remember it. She told him to put it in his catalog, and then she turned the cold iron ship toward the heart of the gray tide, and drove it in. The Velhari fleet watched it go, and not one of them looked away. Vol Thren pulled his 49 surviving warships back to the far side of Tarn Veled, exactly as Hale had told him, and from there the whole Combine fleet watched the cold iron ship turn into the gray tide and drive deeper. They had never seen anything like it. The Velhari had spent 9,000 years certain that humanity had run from the galaxy, and now they watched a single human warship do the opposite of running, watched it choose the center of a hunger that ate worlds, and the sight rearranged something in every Velhari who saw it, permanently, in a way the catalogs would never quite be able to record. The Maw took the Aegis Far Iron the way it took everything. As the cold iron drove toward the core, the tide closed around it, thousands of grown hulls wrapping the ship in flesh and bone, squeezing, consuming, throwing the entire weight of a planet-eating horror against 900 meters of human warship. The field held longer than it had any right to. Hale drove the ship through the closing dark, deeper, past the swarming hands of the tide, and into the great slow heart of the thing, the dense old core that had been crossing the void since before the Velhari had a word for the void, and the cold iron burned a tunnel through the maw with its own dying brilliance, lighting the inside of the horror like a star lit inside a storm cloud. On the bridge, the alarms were everything now. The field was failing, section by section, as the whole mass of the maw bore down on the one ship that had ever made it bleed. Ash Corwin called out the range to the core, the numbers dropping fast, and Hale held the ship on its line and did not flinch. Around her, 212 people did their jobs in the failing light, calm, because they had always known it would come to this. Because a crew you bury for 9,000 years is a crew that has already made its peace with the asking. The hull groaned. The amber light flickered. Priya Sand kept the run plotted true even as her own station began to burn, calling the corrections in a steady voice while the heart of the maw swelled in the viewport, vast and pale and old, the original mass, the thing that had eaten 1,000 worlds. The range fell. The field died, panel by panel, and the range to the heart of the maw reached 0. Captain Imogen Hale fired the far iron. The Velhari, watching from beyond the green world, saw the gray tide light up from the inside. They saw a single point of white fire bloom at the center of the horror, small at first, then not small, then larger than anything their instruments could measure, a brilliance that climbed and climbed until it was brighter than the system's own sun. The far iron reached into the dense old heart of the maw, the core that had eaten 1,000 worlds across 10,000 years, and it unmade it, every fiber, every cell, every patient-hungry piece of the thing, all at once, in a flash of light that the Combine's observatories 3 jumps away recorded and could never afterward explain. The maw died, not damaged, not driven off, dead, the whole continent of gray hulls going dark and still and lifeless in the same instant, the core unmade, thousands of grown ships drifting suddenly inert, a tide with no heart to drive it, a hunger with nothing left to feed it. The horror that had been crossing the galaxy since before the Velhari Combine existed, the thing that had killed Heshet and would have killed Tarn Velid and 1,000 worlds after it, ended in a single flash of human white fire above a green world it never reached, and at the center of that fire, the Aegis far iron had been. The Velhari fleet held its position for a long time after the light faded, and no one said anything, and no one fired, and no one moved, because there was nothing to fight anymore and nothing to say that would be equal to what they had just seen. The gray tide drifted dead and cooling across half the sky. The green world below turned on, untouched, 200 million Velhari, going about their lives with no idea how close the gray had come, or what had stopped it, or what it had cost the thing that stopped it. Vol Thren took his ships forward, slowly, into the field of dead growth where the maw had been. He was looking for wreckage. He was looking for the cold iron, for some piece of the ship that had saved his world, because a part of him refused to believe that anything which had fought like that could simply be gone. His crews swept the debris for hours. They found the dead hulls of the maw, going to slag. They found nothing of the Aegis far iron at all. The far iron had been fired from the center of the tide, at point-blank range against the core, and the death of the maw's heart had taken everything near it, exactly as Hale had said it would, including the ship that fired the shot, and the 212 people aboard who had given up their whole world and their whole time to make sure it was fired. There was nothing to recover. There was only a name. Vol Thren had asked for it, at the end, and she had given it, and told him to remember it, and told him to put it in his catalog. So he did. He took the name back to the Velhari High Administration, the same Combine that had laughed at a relic and shot at a museum piece and sent 300 salvage hulls to dig up a tomb ship and sell it for scrap. He stood before the administration that had been certain for 9,000 years that humanity was dead, and he told them what he had seen, and this time no one laughed. He told them about the warning, given 3 times and refused 3 times, and how the human ship had spared 300 Velhari lives when it could have ended them all. He told them about Heshet and what had eaten it, and how the relic they had wanted to sell was the only thing in the galaxy that had ever fought that horror and won. He told them about Tarn Velid, about the cold iron shield thrown across a breaking fleet, about a human captain who had put her ship between 200 million strangers and the end of everything, and then driven that ship into the center of a planet-eater to make sure the strangers lived. He told them, too, about the quiet order he had been given, the order to seize the human ship in the confusion of the battle, and he told them, before the whole assembled administration, that he had deleted it, and that he would delete it again, and that any commander who would steal from the ship that died to save his world did not deserve to command anything at all. And the administration, which had given that order in a cold private room and was ashamed of it, said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence had not already said for them. And then Volthren told them the name, Captain Imogen Hale, the Aegis Far Iron, the human admiralty, a species the Combine had been so very, very certain was gone. The Velhari Combine changed, after Tarn Veled. It did not change all at once, because 9,000 years of certainty does not change all at once, but it changed. The administration sent ships back to Site 92, not to dig, but to seal it, to mark the empty grave of the ship that had come out of it as a protected place, a monument, the spot where the humans had woken up. They went looking for the other tombs, the other dead worlds, the other cold iron ships that the human admiralty had buried across the dark 9,000 years ago, and where they found them, they did not dig, they left them sleeping. They set beacons around them and they let them rest, those sleeping teeth of a vanished species, because the Combine understood now what it had taken them so long and cost so many to learn, that the humans had not run from the galaxy, that they had stood against a horror older than the Combine, and lost only the time, never the will, and then they had buried their best and bravest in the cold dark ground and set them to wait, against all hope, for the day they would be needed again. And they had been needed again, and they had not failed. There was an argument, in the years that followed, among the Velhari historians who had spent their whole careers cataloging dead human worlds. Some of them said the Combine should wake the other ships, should dig up the cold iron and crew it with Velhari and turn it into a fleet, because a galaxy with one maw in it was a galaxy that surely held others, and the Combine had no weapon of its own that could touch such a thing. But the argument always died in the same place, against the same cold truth, and it was Volthren, old now and never again willing to laugh at anything human, who said it plainest. The cold iron was not a weapon the Combine could pick up and use. It was a thing the humans had built, and crewed, and died inside, on purpose, knowing the cost, and a Velhari could not climb into that and make the same shot, because a Velhari had not made the same choice. The ships would wake when they were needed, for whoever needed them, the way the Aegis Far Iron had woken for a Combine that did not deserve it, and until then, the only honest thing to do was to keep the watch, and let them sleep, and be ready to stand beside them when they rose. So the Combine kept the watch. They became, slowly, over generations, the guardians of the human tombs, a species that had once stripped human worlds for scrap, turned into the keepers of human graves, and they never once dug again. They taught it in the brood schools, in place of the old certainty. They taught their hatchlings that the dead are not always dead, that a thing buried with care is a thing that mattered, and that the proper response to a creature which asks you, calmly, 3 times, to leave it in peace, is to leave it in peace. The story did not stay inside the Combine. Stories like that never do. The Velhari shared their space with other species, traders and neighbors and rivals across a dozen star systems, and most of those species had their own catalogs, their own certainties, their own quiet assumption that the humans were a dead thing and human metal was scrap. The story of the Aegis Far Iron reached them the way the best and worst news always travels, fast and changed and impossible to stop, and it did to them what it had done to the Combine. It made them go and check their own records. It made them look at the dead human worlds in their own sectors with a new and careful eye, and quietly, without ever admitting why, the salvage fleets of a dozen species stopped digging up human graves, because not one of them wanted to be the crew that found the next cold iron ship, and laughed, and learned. There was a species 3 sectors away, the Ulthen, who had been the first to laugh at the Combine when the news of the disarmed reclamation fleet reached them, who had called it a Velhari fairy tale, an excuse for incompetence, a dead empire frightening itself with the bones of an older one. The Ulthen stopped laughing too, in time. They sent a quiet delegation to Tarn Veled, years later, to see the place where it had happened, and they stood with the Velhari at the edge of the dead growth where the maw had ended, and they asked Volthren, who was old by then, whether the story was true. And Volthren told them it was, and that it was worse than the story, because the story made the humans sound like heroes, and they were not heroes. They were something harder to understand than heroes. They were a people who had looked at a galaxy that would forget them, and a horror that would outlive them, and decided, anyway, to leave a shield in the ground for whoever came after. The Othan went home and sealed their own human graves, and that was how the watch spread, species by species, until half the galaxy was keeping a vigil over the sleeping teeth of a people they had once been certain were dead. The story spread across the Combine, world to world, the way the best stories do, and it changed in the telling, the way the best stories do, but the heart of it never changed. The aliens laughed at the humans. They laughed at a relic, at a museum piece, at a dead species and its dead machines, at a tomb ship they had come to weigh and sell. They laughed right up until they uncovered Earth's lost battleship, and the cold iron came out of the ground, and the laughing stopped, and what they found buried under 300 meters of stone on a dead gray world was not scrap at all. It was a shield. It had always been a shield. The lexicon had been right, 9,000 years late. A hard cold metal that holds its edge, a metal that does not bend in the dark. The Velhari had dug up the last shield of a vanished people, and that shield had risen out of its own grave, and stood between the Combine and the end of everything, and asked for nothing, and given everything, and then it was gone. The Combine kept its name. They put it in the catalog, at the top, in the place reserved for the things a species must never let itself forget. Aegis Far Iron, Captain Imogen Hale, 212. They put it where every Velhari hatchling in the brood schools would read it, and beside it they wrote the only lesson worth taking from the whole long terrible business. The lesson that a species 9,000 years certain of its own superiority had paid 200 million near deaths and one impossible ship to finally learn. When something tells you 3 times, calmly, and very politely, that it does not want to fight you, listen. And when you find a thing buried in the ground that someone built a tomb to protect, do not assume it is dead. Some things are not buried because they died. Some things are buried because they are too dangerous to leave lying around, and too precious to destroy, and so you put them in the cold dark ground and you set them to sleep, and you pray you never have to wake them. The Velhari had woken one. They had laughed when they did it, and they spent the rest of their long history making very sure that the laughter, and what it cost, and the name of the cold iron ship that had answered it, were never, ever forgotten. On the dead gray world called Site 92, the empty grave still stands, 300 meters deep, sealed now and marked with a beacon that the Combine renews every year. There is nothing in it. The cold iron is gone, burned to nothing in the heart of a horror it died to kill. But the Velhari go there still, the ones who remember, and they stand at the rim of the pit where they once laughed, and they read the name they carved into the stone, and they keep the watch that the humans kept for 9,000 years. Because somewhere out in the dark, there are other graves, other dead worlds, other ships of cold iron, sleeping under stone, waiting against all hope for the day they will be needed. And the Velhari Combine, which once laughed at a relic and learned better, intends to be ready, this time, to stand beside them when they wake.